There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when everything falls apart at the same time. It is not the comfortable silence of a Sunday morning, nor the peaceful quiet of a forest at dusk. It is the silence of shock, the kind that wraps around your chest and tightens until breathing becomes a conscious effort, something you have to remember to do. It was that silence that accompanied me through every room in the autumn of my 43rd year, and it was in that silence that most people, those who thought they knew me, made their first and most catastrophic mistake. They looked at me and saw someone destroyed. What they could not see was someone who was only just beginning. My name is Daniela Hargrove, and this is not a story about suffering. It is a story about strategy. It is a story about what happens when the world takes everything from you, and you discover, in the emptiness that remains, that what was taken was never really you. It was only what you were told you were. And the moment you realize the difference between who you were told to be and who you actually are, that is the moment that changes everything. That is the moment I am going to show you step by step, because I do not believe it happened by accident, and I do not believe it can only happen to someone like me. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of my life, although that matters, and we will get there, but to the beginning of the year that seemed, to everyone watching from the outside, like my end. In March of that year, I lost my job. Not just any job, the job around which I had built my entire identity for 11 years. I was the regional director of operations for a mid-sized logistics company called Pinnacle Systems, and I had given that company the best hours of my best years. I had canceled vacations for it. I had missed birthdays for it. I had sat in my car in parking lots at 11 at night, eating a cold sandwich and answering emails on my phone, because the work never stopped, and I had convinced myself that was what dedication looked like. When my supervisor, a man named Gerald Whitmore, called me into his office and told me the company was restructuring and that my position was being eliminated, he had the decency to look mildly embarrassed, but only mildly. He slid a severance package across the desk with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times before, and said something I will never forget. He said, "Daniela, I hope you take some time to figure out what comes next." He said it the way you would say it to someone who has no idea what comes next. He said it the way a person speaks to someone who has never really figured anything out at all. I signed the papers. I left that building through the lobby I had walked through 10,000 times. I sat in my car, the same parking lot, the same cold air, and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. I did not cry. I was too stunned to cry. Crying requires that you understand what has happened, and I had not yet processed the magnitude of it. I drove home, and that night, as I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of water and a silence so dense it had weight, my phone rang. It was my husband, Victor. Or rather, it was the man who would soon become my ex-husband, though neither of us yet knew that precise term would apply so soon. Victor had been at his brother's house for 2 weeks at that point, taking what he called some time to think. We had been struggling for a long time, in the way couples sometimes struggle without ever naming the struggle exactly. The slow accumulation of small distances, the conversations that grew shorter, the evenings spent in the same room but somehow very far apart. He was calling to tell me he had been thinking, and that he did not see a path forward for us, and that he thought it would be better for both of them if we began the process of formal separation. He was gentle about it. Victor is one of the gentlest people I have ever known, which in some ways made everything sharper. There is a particular grief that comes from being left tenderly. It leaves no bruises you can show people. It leaves something quieter and deeper something that takes much longer to name. By April, I had lost my job and my marriage within 30 days. I was living alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and strange, like the set of a life that was no longer being performed. I was behind on the mortgage because my severance, though generous on paper, had not yet accounted for the sudden halving of my household income. I was 43 years old, and 43 is an age at which the world has very particular expectations of you, most of which involve having things figured out, and I had never felt less figured out in my life. This is where people who knew me from a distance began to talk. Not maliciously, or at least, not always maliciously. People talk because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and narrating others' disasters gives the narrator the temporary illusion of safety. "Have you heard about Daniela?" became, I was told later, a common opening for conversations at social gatherings I was no longer attending. "She's really struggling. She looks terrible." "I don't think she's handling it well." One person, a woman named Claudia Sherwood, who had been my colleague for 7 years and whom I had considered a genuine friend, told a mutual acquaintance that she thought I was having some kind of breakdown. She was not entirely wrong about the symptoms, but she was profoundly wrong about the diagnosis, and that distinction turned out to be everything. What Claudia saw when she ran into me at the grocery store at the end of April was a woman who looked tired and distracted, and who forgot to ask about her children. What Claudia could not see, because it was entirely internal, and I had not yet learned to display it externally, was a woman who, for the first time in adult life, was paying very close attention. Not to the world around her, to herself, to the question that the silence had finally forced her to stop avoiding. Who are you really? When you strip away the titles, the roles, and the things other people expect you to be. I want to be careful here because I think there is a version of this story that is tempting to tell, but ultimately dishonest. The tempting version is, I lost everything. I was quiet for a while. I had an epiphany, and I rose like a phoenix from the ashes of my former life. That version is seductive because it is clean. But the real version is messier, and I believe, more useful to you. Because if you are reading this, there is a chance you are in your own April. And you deserve the real story, not the polished version. The real story is that May was worse than April. May was when grief began to catch up with the shock. May was when I woke at 3 in the morning more nights than not, lying in a bed too large, in a house too silent, and the thoughts that came to me in those hours were not strategic or hopeful. They were the kind that work best in the dark, the ones that catalog your failures with great thoroughness, the ones that remind you of every moment you chose wrong, every path you did not take, every version of yourself you left unrealized. May was when I stopped eating properly, when the gym I had paid for every month for 6 years went unused for the first time, when I watched more television in 30 days than in the previous 3 years combined. May was when my mother called and heard something in my voice that made her drive 4 hours to stay with me for a week, and she is not a woman who panics easily. But May was also when something else happened, something small and quiet that I almost missed because it announced itself with no particular drama. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I had been sitting at the kitchen table for the 3rd consecutive hour, doing essentially nothing, and I noticed a notebook on the shelf across the room. It was one of those plain black hardcover notebooks, the kind people buy with great intention and never quite fill. I had owned it for at least 2 years without ever having written more than a page in it. On some impulse I cannot fully explain, I got up, took it down, sat back down, and opened it to the first blank page. I did not write anything inspiring. I did not write a vision statement or a set of goals or the opening lines of the motivational book I was definitely not planning to write. I wrote a question, 3 words. What do I actually know how to do? And then, because I had nothing but time and the particular and relentless honesty that comes from having nothing left to protect, I began to answer. I wrote for 4 hours. I filled 9 pages. And what emerged from those 9 pages was not what I expected. I expected a list of professional skills, logistics management, team leadership, operational efficiency, the standard vocabulary of a mid-level corporate resume. Some of that was there, but what was also there, surfacing from the sediment of all those years of identifying myself by job title, was something entirely different. There were skills I had forgotten I possessed because I had never been paid for them, and had therefore, unconsciously, filed them as worthless. There was the fact that I had spent years tutoring my niece and nephew in mathematics, and that I had a rare ability to explain complex numerical concepts in ways that non-mathematical people could absorb. There was the fact that I had been reading obsessively about behavioral economics and decision theory since my late 20s, for no reason other than pure interest, and that I had accumulated what was, by any reasonable measure, an unusual depth of knowledge in that area. There was the fact that I had spent 6 months in my early 30s studying Spanish and had never continued beyond the intermediate level, not because I lacked ability, but because I had told myself I was too busy. And there it was again, that word, busy, which had been the ceiling of so many things that could have been so much more. I looked at those 9 pages and felt something shift. Not a dramatic shift. Not the shift of someone who has seen the light and been transformed. More like the shift of someone who had been searching for their keys for an hour and suddenly checked their own coat pocket. A small, quiet, mildly embarrassing realization. Oh, they were here all along. I want to tell you about a woman named Theodora Bancroft, because Theodora is important to this story, in a way that only became clear much later. Theodora was 61 years old when I met her, in the parking lot of the public library, in June of that year. I had started going to the library regularly, partly because it was free, and I was being careful with money, and partly because it was one of the few public spaces where sitting in silence for long stretches is not considered worrying behavior. Theodora was sitting on a bench outside the library, eating a sandwich and reading a physical newspaper, an actual printed newspaper, which seemed somewhat anachronistic but somehow also completely right. She looked up as I walked past and said with no particular preamble, "You look like a woman trying to solve a problem she hasn't named yet." I stopped. I do not know why I stopped. I am not usually the kind of person who stops for strangers making observations about my psychological state, but something in the specificity of it, trying to solve a problem she hasn't named yet, landed precisely on something I had been feeling without being able to articulate. And so, instead of walking on, I said, "That's an odd thing to say to someone you've never met." Theodora smiled. "Occupational habit," she said. "I was a therapist for 32 years. You develop a certain eye." I sat down on the bench. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Theodora was retired, recently widowed, and in the process of writing what she described as not exactly a memoir, more like a field guide to the second half of life. She had a quality I recognized immediately but rarely encounter. She was wholly and without affectation, interested in other people, not in the way of polite questions, Not in the extractive way some people use interest as a tool for their own social purposes, but in the genuine, deep, and quiet way that suggests a person who has spent so much time listening to others that she has become extraordinarily good at it. I told her about my year. Not everything, not yet, but the outline. The job, Victor, the house, the notebook. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "The people around you are probably reading your situation as a breakdown. What they're missing is that a breakdown and a clearing look identical from the outside. The only person who can tell the difference is the one living it. So tell me, which one is it?" I did not answer immediately. I thought for a while that felt long, and then I said, "I think it's a clearing, but I'm still afraid it might be a breakdown." She nodded as if that were the most reasonable thing anyone had ever said. "Good," she said. "The ones who are certain it's a clearing are usually wrong. The ones who are afraid it might be a breakdown but keep going anyway. Those are the ones who find out." I walked home from the library that afternoon feeling different. Not better exactly. Not healed. But different. As if something that had been out of focus had shifted, fractionally, toward clarity. By July, I had made 3 decisions that the people around me, had they known, would probably have considered additional evidence of instability. The first was that I was going to sell the house, not because I needed to. The severance was covering the mortgage for now. But because the house was a monument to a version of my life that no longer existed. And every morning I woke up in it, I was waking up inside someone else's story. The second decision was that I was going to spend 90 days studying, intensively and with genuine seriousness, the intersection of behavioral economics and personal finance education, which was the specific combination of my forgotten knowledge and professional skills that those 9 pages in the notebook had flagged as potentially significant. The third decision was quieter, and in some respects, the most important. I was going to stop explaining myself to the people who had already decided what my situation meant. This last decision sounds simple. It was not. There is a powerful social pull toward justifying yourself to people who knew you before, toward reassuring them that you are fine, that you have a plan, that what they are watching is not what it looks like. Part of that impulse is genuine and understandable. Part of it, if you're honest with yourself, is about managing their discomfort more than your own recovery. I had spent 43 years being very good at managing other people's discomfort. I was learning, slowly, and with significant resistance from my own habits, to stop. When I told my mother I was going to sell the house, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Are you sure that's sensible?" When I told my friend Marcus Webb, who had been my closest friend since college and who genuinely wanted the best for me, about the 90-day study plan, he looked at me with the careful, measured expression people use when they are worried but trying not to show it too obviously, and said, "Interesting. What's the plan after that?" When Claudia Sherwood heard through the network that I was selling the house, I was told she said, "I think she's really going off the deep end." None of these responses surprised me. What surprised me was how little they affected me. 6 months earlier, any one of these responses would have sent me into a spiral of hesitation and people-pleasing adjustments. Now they passed through me and left something resembling determination in their wake, not defiance. I want to be precise about that, because there is an important difference. Defiance is reactive. It is still being controlled by others' opinions, only in the opposite direction. What I was building was not defiance. It was indifference to outcomes I had not chosen. It was the quiet, durable independence of a person who had stopped asking permission to be herself. The house sold in August, faster than I expected, and for more than the asking price. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a modest, clean building that had large windows that let in light every morning. I bought a desk and a good chair, and a whiteboard that I mounted on the wall of the spare room I was converting into workspace. I set a timer every morning for 8 hours, and treated those 8 hours with the same seriousness I had once given a job that did not know my name. I read, I wrote, I mapped, I built. What I was building in those quiet months was a framework. I will describe it carefully, because I believe the framework itself is more important than any particular result it produced, and because I believe it is replicable. Not exactly, you are not me, and your specific intersection of forgotten skills, professional experience, and genuine interest will look different from mine. But the shape of it, the logic of it, I believe is something anyone can apply. The framework had 3 phases. I called them, without creativity but with precision, the inventory phase, the architecture phase, and the launch phase. The inventory phase was the notebook. It was the relentless, time-generous, judgment-suspended cataloging of everything you actually know how to do. Not what you were paid to do, not what other people think you do well, but what you genuinely, demonstrably, and repeatedly know how to do. The key word is actually, what do I actually know how to do? Most people, when they try this exercise, spend the first 20 minutes listing their professional skills and then stall. The unlocking requires going further back, to childhood, to hobbies, to the things you did at 10 years old, before someone told you those things were not practical. It requires listing things that feel embarrassingly small or obviously useless. It requires the willingness to look at something and say, I don't know yet how this is valuable. I only know it's real. The architecture phase was where those inventory items were connected. This is the phase that requires the most creativity and the most honesty. And I want to be precise about what I mean by both words in this context. Creativity here does not mean generating fantastic or unrealistic ideas. It means being genuinely open to combinations and applications you would not have considered if you were operating from within the identity framework of your former life. And honesty here means something equally specific, the willingness to evaluate each potential combination, not on the basis of how impressive it sounds or how easily you can explain it at dinner parties, but on the basis of whether it is truly aligned with what you know, what you are genuinely interested in, and what gap in the world it is actually addressing. For me, the combination that emerged from the architecture phase was this. There is a large and demonstrably underserved population of adults, particularly adults in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, who are navigating significant life transitions, who lack the behavioral and financial literacy tools to make good decisions precisely during the periods when the quality of decisions matters most. I knew things about behavioral economics that most financial advisors do not know. I knew things about operational decision-making that most therapists and coaches do not know. I had a particular talent, confirmed over years of informal practice, for translating complex frameworks into language that non-specialists could absorb and use. This combination, at that intersection, was not a niche I had invented. It was a gap I had found. There is an important difference. Niches are built. Gaps are found. Gaps are real because real people are falling through them, right now, looking for something that does not yet exist in the form they need. The launch phase is the one most people want to skip, and the one most people execute poorly when they do attempt it. Because launching is not primarily about marketing or branding or building an audience, although those things matter. Launching is first and most fundamentally about doing the work with such thoroughness and such genuine attention to the people you are serving that the work begins to speak for itself before you have said a single word publicly about it. The launch phase, as I practiced it, began 6 months before anyone outside of Theodora Bancroft and my mother knew what I was doing. I spent those 6 months building. I wrote 37 long articles, not for an audience, not for publication, only to prove to myself that I could and to discover what I actually thought. I created a curriculum, 12 modules, each addressing a specific mode of decision-making failure that I had seen, both in my professional experience and in my own life, cause significant and often avoidable harm. I ran the curriculum for free for 9 people who had been referred to me through a network I had been slowly building by being genuinely useful to individuals rather than broadcasting myself to groups. The 9 people included a recently divorced teacher named Sylvia Park, a recently laid-off engineer named Robert Altman, a 38-year-old entrepreneur named Cassandra Finley, who had just sold her first company and did not know what to do next, and 6 others whose situations shared the same essential quality. They were intelligent, capable people standing at crossroads without a map, and the conventional guides available to them: financial advisors, therapists, career coaches, self-help books. Each addressed one angle of a multi-angle problem and left all the rest unanswered. I watched what happened with those 9 people over the 6 months we worked together. I do not want to exaggerate or dress this in the language of miracle, because that would be dishonest, and because the reality is more interesting than any miracle. What happened was that, one by one, they stopped making decisions from inside their fear and began making decisions from inside a framework they actually understood and could apply. Sylvia Park, who had come to me paralyzed by a financial situation she described as completely beyond me, left with a 2-year plan she had built herself and a set of decision-making tools she called, in her own words, the first practical thing anyone has ever given me. Robert Altman, who had become so demoralized by his layoff that he had applied for 47 jobs in 2 months without a single callback, stepped back from the spray-and-pray approach and identified through the inventory process a specific intersection of his engineering experience and his unrealized ability in technical communication that led him to a role he had not known to look for. Cassandra Finley, who was stuck in what she called post-exit paralysis, the disorienting freedom that comes from achieving a long-term goal and then having nothing left to move toward, built a clear picture of what she actually wanted the next chapter to look like, and it was not what she had expected. It was better. I want to pause here for a moment, because I know there is a question forming in your mind. I can almost hear it. The question is, all right, but when did it work? When was the business actually launched? When did the external world catch up to what was happening internally? When did the people who had written off Daniela Hargrove discover they were wrong? And I am going to answer that question. I am going to answer it in detail, because the details matter, and because they are the part of the story that most people, when telling stories like this one, skip, compress, or smooth until they become unrecognizable. But first, I want to sit with you for a moment in the part before that, because I think the part before external validation is the most important part, and I think it is the part most people do not survive. Not because they lack ability, but because they cannot tolerate the silence long enough to discover what is waiting inside it. In those months of building in silence, there were many days when I did not believe it was going to work. Many days when the contrast between the internal clarity I was developing and the external reality I still inhabited, the modest apartment, the depleted savings, the friends who called less often because they did not know what to say, the ex-husband who was building a new life and moving forward in ways that, though I genuinely wished him well, were sometimes painful to observe. The contrast between those two things was very high. There were days when the voice that sounded like Gerald Whitmore, like Claudia Sherwood, like every person who had ever looked at me in that careful and slightly too gentle way and implied that I needed to figure out what came next. There were days when that voice was significantly louder than my own. I want to tell you what I did on those days, because I think it is practical, and you can use it. On those days, I opened the notebook, not to a new page, to the 9 pages from May, the inventory ones, the ones that had started all of this. I read slowly. I reminded myself that nothing written on those pages had come from outside me. They were not things someone had told me I was good at, or encouraged me to pursue, or given me permission to claim. They had come from the most honest accounting I had ever made of my actual self, stripped of all the roles, identities, and titles that had been organizing my sense of who I was. And every time I read those pages, something in me settled. Not triumphantly, not dramatically, just settled, like the needle of a compass finding north after being shaken for a long time. The other thing I did, and this is the thing that surprised me most about my own process, was call Theodora Bancroft. We had stayed in touch since the library parking lot, meeting for coffee roughly once a month. Theodora was the only person during that period who never asked me when I was going to figure out what came next. Not because she was incurious, but because she was the only person who understood that figuring out what came next was exactly what I was doing. And that the work of figuring it out was still invisible because it was happening on the inside, where the real work always happens first. In one of our conversations in late October, I told Theodora I was afraid of being wrong, not wrong about the specific direction I was taking, but wrong about something deeper. Wrong about myself. Wrong to trust the inventory. Wrong to believe that the intersection I had found was real, and not merely the wishful thinking of a woman who needed things to work out. Theodora listened to all of this in her particular way, completely, without interrupting, without rushing toward reassurance. And when I finished, she said, "The fear of being wrong about yourself is healthy. The people who are certain they are right about themselves frighten me. But I want to ask you something. Is the fear stopping you from doing the work?" I thought about it. "No," I said. "It's not stopping me. It just makes the work heavier." Theodora nodded. "That's not fear," she said. "That's respect for the stakes. Keep going." The launch happened in January, 14 months after I had been called into Gerald Whitmore's office. I want to be specific about what launch meant in practice, because I think the word carries connotations of fanfare and sudden visibility that did not apply to my experience. The launch was the moment I made the work public. I published a detailed article about the behavioral decision-making curriculum I had developed, shared it through professional networks I had been quietly rebuilding, and opened enrollment for a paid version of the 12-module program. I charged what felt to me like a significant amount. Several people in my circle, upon learning the price, raised their eyebrows. Some people said something to the effect that I was being overly ambitious for someone who was just starting out. I noted the feedback and proceeded. The first cohort filled in 11 days. Not because I had a large audience. I did not. Not because I had run advertising campaigns. I had not done that either. But because 9 people who had gone through the program for free had described it to other people in specific, detailed and personal terms. Not, "It was great." The specific, granular, "you had to have been there" language of people who had actually experienced something useful. Sylvia Park sent a message to a group of 12 women she knew who were navigating divorces or major financial transitions. Robert Altman mentioned it in a post about his new role that described, in detail, the process he had used to find it. Cassandra Finley spoke about it at a conference for post-exit founders, which was a community I had not known about, and which turned out to be extraordinarily hungry for the kind of thinking I had been developing. By March, 2 years after I had been sitting in a parking lot eating a cold sandwich and answering emails for a company that did not know my name, I had a waiting list. I had more inbound interest than I could serve. I had begun working with an operations specialist named Priya Holt, who had heard about the program through the Founder Network and who had immediately understood what it was and what it needed to become. I had revenue that exceeded my former salary. I had, most importantly, a sense of what I was doing and why that was clearer, deeper, and more personally rooted than anything I had felt in the 11 years I had given to Pinnacle Systems. I did not call Gerald Whitmore. I did not call Claudia Sherwood. I did not publish anything designed to signal to the people who had pitied or dismissed me that they had been wrong. I did not need to, and the reason I did not need to is the most important thing I learned from this entire experience. The thing I want to leave you with before we reach the end of this story. The external validation, when it came, was pleasant. I will not pretend it was not. There is a legitimate satisfaction in demonstrating, through results, that the path you were building in private was real and not imaginary. But the satisfaction was smaller compared to what I had already been feeling since May. Since those 9 pages in the notebook, since the moment I stopped confusing the silence with an ending and started listening to what it was trying to tell me. The external validation was a footnote. The real story had already happened, in silence, before anyone was watching. I think of Theodora Bancroft saying, "A breakdown and a clearing look identical from the outside," and I think that is true of far more than a difficult year. I think it is true of marriages and careers and identities and belief systems and creative practices and relationships and almost everything that involves the painful and necessary stripping away of a form that no longer serves. From the outside, the stripping away looks like collapse. But from the inside, if you are willing to stay inside long enough, if you can resist the impulse to perform recovery before it has actually happened, if you can sit with the 9 pages in the notebook and trust that the person they describe is real. From the inside, it is an entirely different thing. It is preparation. It is the careful, quiet, serious work of becoming who you were always going to be, if only you had stopped long enough to find out. There is a woman I know now, through the program, through the network that has grown around it, whose name is Eleanor Graves. Eleanor is 51 years old, and is in her own version of the year that seemed, to everyone watching, like her end. She lost her mother, her business partnership, and her apartment within 4 months. She came to me not looking for inspiration. She was very clear about that, but looking for a framework, something practical, something she could actually use. We worked together for 3 months, and I watched her do what I know now to be the hardest and most essential work a person can do. She looked, honestly, and without blinking, at who she actually was, stripped of everything that had been taken from her. And what she found there surprised her. It always does, because the people who appear to be falling apart are almost never actually falling apart. They are almost always clearing away what was in the way. Eleanor is building something now, I am not going to tell you what it is, because it is hers, and it is not my story to tell. But I will tell you that the last time I saw her, she had that look, the one I recognize now, the one I could not have described before I felt it myself. The look of someone who knows something that the people around her have not yet discovered. Not arrogance, not defiance, just a particular quiet, unhurried certainty. The look of someone who is planning something. The look of someone who has stopped performing destroyed and begun practicing becoming. I thought I was destroyed once. I sat in silence that had weight, and did not know how long it would last or what would be on the other side of it. I had no guarantee of anything. Not the business, not the relationships, not the specific external outcomes that eventually came. What I had was 9 pages in a notebook and the willingness to believe, against significant internal and external pressure, that the person those 9 pages described was worth the bet. And I want to tell you, whether you are in your March, your May, or your October, whether the silence around you is recent or has lasted longer than you want to admit, whether the people in your life are reading you as a collapse or simply as someone who needs to figure out what comes next, I want to tell you that the bet is worth making. Not because it always pays off in the obvious external ways, but because the act of making it, the act of looking honestly at yourself, and deciding that what you find there is worth building, that act changes you in ways that have nothing to do with any particular outcome. It makes you, for the first time, the author of your own story, rather than a character in someone else's reading of you. They thought I was destroyed. They had no idea what I was planning. And here is what I learned, on the other side of that. The planning itself, before the outcome, before the validation, before anyone else could see it. That was what mattered most. That is where it was won. It is where it is always won. In the silence, in the notebook, in the long, unglamorous and private work of becoming. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it landed where you needed it to, I want to ask you something. Not to follow me, not to share this with the world, not for any reason that benefits me. I want to ask one thing of you. Open something you can write in, right now, today, and ask yourself the 3 words that started this for me. What do I actually know how to do? Write as the words come. Do not edit. Do not evaluate. Do not decide yet whether anything is useful. Just write. And then read back what you wrote slowly, the way you would read something a person you respect had said to you. Because that person, the one who wrote those pages, that is the person you are going to need for what comes next. That is the person who has been waiting beneath the noise, beneath the performance, beneath the identity you built for the comfort of others, to show you what you have always been planning to do. The comment section below this story is where I want you to start. Tell me which year you're in. Your March, your May, your October. Tell me what the silence sounds like. Tell me what you are beginning to suspect might be in the notebook if you opened it. Because I read every comment, every one, and because every story matters, and yours is no exception. And the moment you stop being the person others feel sorry for and begin being the person who is quietly, deliberately, and unstoppably planning, that moment is worth naming. Even here, even publicly, perhaps especially publicly. If this found you at the right moment, subscribe, because the work continues, and you deserve to be here for it. If it moved something in you, like it so that the next person who needs it can find it. And if you have someone in your life who is in their own silent year, someone who, from the outside, appears to be falling apart, share it with her. Not as pity, not as a fix, just as a reminder that what the silence is hiding may be exactly what she was always going to become, if only she can stay in it long enough to find out.